Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.
Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Dis Affamie History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past, what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you.
Welcome to Dis Affamie History Podcast with your host, Wendy Aris. Today, we're honoured to welcome Dr. Danielle Gibbs, a UK-based genealogist whose passion lies in helping others reconnect with their roots in England, Jamaica, and beyond. Her love for uncovering family histories has taken her deep into centuries of records, stories, and ancestral connections. This passion led her to establish her business, GenieDans, where she supports others on their own genealogical journeys. Whether you're just starting out or have been researching for years, Dr. Gibbs's expertise and insight will inspire you. In this episode, we'll explore the vibrant histories of Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago, the determination it takes to trace your lineage, and how one woman's mission is empowering communities to reclaim their stories. So sit back, relax, and let's dive in to the conversation.
I just wanted to thank you so much, Danielle, for coming on to the podcast, Dis Affamie History, to speak about your business and, of course, how you research in terms of with genealogy, family history. So before we start, I'll have you just do a brief introduction of yourself.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, and thank you for having me on your podcast. I'm Dans, and I am fairly early in my professional career as a genealogist, but I research for people, their ancestors in Jamaica and in England, and also my family research for myself in Jamaica and in Trinidad, and for my husband in England and Finland.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that. And I guess, would you be able to tell us, how you start about GenieDans and the primary focus of your genealogy business?
So GenieDans came about from, personally, I've been looking to tell my daughter, my first child, about her ancestors. And on my husband's side, I'd met his Finnish and English grandmothers, but I could tell her lots about those families, but I realized I couldn't actually tell her much about my family at all. And I was like, hold on a second. Why have I not been asking questions? Why have I just accepted this limited amount of knowledge? So I started asking the questions. I started digging, started getting a lot of answers on my Jamaican side, and then I was just absolutely bitten by the bug. And then it came to, I enjoyed not only making those discoveries about my ancestors for myself, but also sharing those with close and distant family, telling them more about our shared ancestors. And then one day I was sitting there at my mother-in-law's house, and my husband's brother-in-law said, oh yeah, he'd really like to know about his family. So I pulled out the laptop and I started searching on Ancestry and finding bits about his family. And I was like, wow, actually, I'm enjoying this, for doing this for him, not necessarily for me, but doing it for his family. And thought, I might like to do this for more people. And I found that I find it just as rewarding rediscovering those ancestors for other people as I do for myself. And that's been, that was really the birth of GenieDans. It's like, okay, well, how can I do this for more people outside of that friends and family circle?
Perfect. So that was what pretty much, motivated you to just start then go to the next level of starting a business.
Yeah, there's just a lot of people out there who want to know about their ancestors, but they either don't know how to, or they don't have the time to do it, or they don't have the research skills to do it. I was lucky, my background in science and researching there, I got my PhD. That gave me some excellent research skills. Although it's a very different field, that ability to research and collate data and be critical when you're looking at it, that can be so important in genealogy research. So I was able to draw on that and use that, whereas a lot of people don't have those skills necessarily. And some people also don't have the money. There's subscriptions to things like Ancestry, and other sites can add up after a while, and it's not feasible for people to be able to do that. So I can kind of step in and use my skills, use my resources to do that for them.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely, because it does take a certain skill set, and grateful that you're able to transfer those skill sets that you have to be able to do this, because it does take you thinking not only within the regular line, but definitely outside of the box as well to capture some of the information that you need. So what were some of the unique challenges of conducting, I guess, genealogical research, especially in Trinidad and Tobago?
So doing the research, as I said, I did my Jamaican, Trinidadian side, my husband's Finnish, and the English side, and they all have their own difficulties, but Trinidad was by far the most difficult one to research. And you've got the normal difficulties that you get with trying to research your Caribbean ancestors, of changing names of people, not only for use of pet names or in the Indian system where they were only using a first name and they weren't using surnames, it was just the father's first name, so that makes it difficult. But in the whole changing from slave names to Christian names and things like that, you've also got the difficulties of accessibility of the records with slavery, the indentureship records, and there's quite a culture of not asking. Children weren't meant to ask. It would seem to be rude to ask about your ancestors and your elders. You don't say, oh, well, what was my grandmother's name? That's not what you call her. So you don't need to know this information. So you've got all of those difficulties. But in Trinidad, there's just the accessibility of records in general. Most countries where you try and look at doing research, you'll find that you can, if there's not available online, like for Jamaica, you've got civil records and parish records available on Family Search. You can spend hours going through individual records, just searching for a needle in a haystack, and sometimes you find it, and that's brilliant. In other places, you've got to apply to the registry office and pay for certificates. And that takes time and it takes money, but you can still progress. In Trinidad, it is incredibly difficult. There's no online records. To try and access records, the civil records, is very, very difficult from abroad. And even when you go in person, it seems to be quite a lot of people, when you talk to them, they just say, oh, well, no, you can't get those records. You're not allowed to get them. And even just trying to get family members to say, can you go to the records office and, ask for this? Like, I don't think you can. And it's a real hurdle. And then indentureship, because my Trinidadian ancestors are Indo-Caribbean, whereas my Jamaican ones are Afro-Caribbean. So in the indentureship case, it hasn't had as much attention, I suppose, slavery has had. So whereas if I was looking for Afro-Caribbean ancestors in Trinidad, you could look into the slave registers. You just have to get past the civil bit, but you could look in the slave registers and look for names. You could look at the plantations and things like that. With the indentureship records, none of that is online. There are brilliant records at the archives for plantation records where you can see where they were in their indentureship and what plantation or estate that they were on. And you can see the Indian arrivals as well. They've got these books where it just lists all of the people as they arrived, their names and where they were coming from and what state they went to. But you can't get to that online. You've got to go to Port of Spain. And that is such a hurdle for people to be able to try and do. Sorry.
No, it's true, because I mean, I can only speak from a reference point of with Jamaica, that you'll be able to find a lot of these records. But I wanted to bring up something else in terms of, let's say, a birth or a marriage or a death record. Does the indication of Cooley, is that shown on any of the records that you've been able to see from Trinidad and Tobago? Because I've seen it in Jamaica.
I haven't seen it come up in the Trinidadian records, but that I think is going to be very much because of my limited exposure to the Trinidadian records. So I see it come up a lot in the Jamaican records. And I need a client with Indian ancestry in Jamaica because I really want to get my teeth in and see how that varies. But unfortunately, none of my Jamaican ancestors are of that Indo-Caribbean population. But it would come up, I would think. From what I've seen, the differences between the islands have not been that vast in terms of how they recorded things. So in Jamaica, if the child was born out of marriage, you don't get the father's details. We see that in the Trinidadian records that I've seen, that doesn't come up then either. But so I assume that they would be using it in the same way that they were using it in Jamaica, but I haven't seen it myself on any particular records for my family.
Yeah. Yeah, I just wanted to know because I know when I first saw that, it was just quite, how to say, it was quite inflammatory actually to see it written like that with just their first name and then in brackets indicating that. So, I guess, how does, colonial history, migration, and of course, record keeping practices affect, of course, this research work?
Well, there's, as I was saying about the father's names, and if the couple weren't married or the child was born out of wedlock, that absence of father's details on there. And you see it quite a lot in the Jamaican records where you go through the civil records, even if the father's there registering the birth, he's not listed as a father. It's just he's not allowed to be listed there. And that can be really tricky, especially where you don't have the same system that you would expect coming from Britain or coming from America or Canada, the kind of thing of, oh, this couple's got together, they've got married, they've had children. That wasn't so much what was happening in that culture. You've also got in the Indian culture that people were getting married within their own religions, and those weren't being recognized as official marriages. So you're still not getting those fathers being written down, although they'd had a Hindu wedding or they'd had a Muslim wedding. You're lacking in that. The real frustration I think that I find as I go back through the indentureship records and through the slavery records is that people are being looked at and recorded as assets and as property rather than trying to document somebody's life journey. It's not about, oh, this is so and so's father or mother, or it's not about the relationships between people. And these are the records that we have. These are the records that we have to use in our research for our family history to try and piece together those family relations. But that's not what they were wanting to record, what their aim was. And so there's so much frustration where it's like, well, if you'd have just thought about these people and as family units, you could have told me so much more about them, but you weren't interested in that. And that's quite a frustration.
No, absolutely. And it's just one of those things where you just have to glean as what you can out of everything to kind of piece together what their life was like and who they were, as well as people from those types of records. Now, would you have like a personal story or a discovery of your own of family research that you would be comfortable in sharing with us?
Yeah, this one's going to be from Jamaica, so from my Jamaican side. But with my granddad, when I was trying to find out about his family, I was really struggling to find his birth record because he actually registered under his mother's maiden name, and he didn't get a first name on his actual birth certificate. So that was added later. So I went wide and I tried to find out as many of his siblings' names as I could and search for their birth records because I didn't know the mother's maiden name either. I just knew the father's surname and the children's first names, but the father's surname wasn't on any of the records. So I had to search through and find all of these children and think, okay, well, I found loads of children with the right names and they're all Florence Pringle's children. So I'm guessing Florence Pringle is the right person that I'm looking for to be the mother. And then I came across these two twin girls and I'd been asking like my elder siblings and saying, well, nobody told me about these twin girls. Who are they? And they're like, you don't have twins. There's no twins in this family. I was like, okay, well, they're coming up as being like the third birth of my great grandmother. And then I went and had a look at the death records. And these two girls had been born in 1916 and then they died in 1918. And when I looked, they died within a week of each other. My my great grandmother's fourth child was about 10 days old when the first one passed. And you see flu written down. And it was the 1918 flu epidemic. And my history had been really terrible. I hadn't actually realized that Spanish flu had got to the islands in that way until I saw that. And then I went through and I was like, okay, so one died in the area that we expected, in the area that we knew that my great grandparents lived. The other one died like a village over. And I can't help but think my great grandmother was sitting there with this 10-day-old baby. You look through these records, and I have a tendency, because you can in the Jamaican records, of when I find a record, I tend to flick back for a few before and a few after just to see what was happening in the area at the time. And as you do, like 5 entries before the first one died, people are dying of fever, 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 fever. And then it becomes flu, 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 flu. And it's like, okay, so this is like at the very start, this epidemic coming. So she's sitting there, she's just had a baby. She's seeing, oh, you hear that so-and-so's died, so-and-so died. And she's seeing that happening. And then her 2-year-old daughter gets sick. And then her twin sister gets sick. And then one dies. And did they sit there and make a decision of saying, that person knows how to heal over there. Let's take the daughter over there and take her to that place to see if we can save her, basically. And I get emotional when I think about it, just because it makes you realize it's really easy to look at the records and see a name and a date and a place and you're just collecting data. But when you kind of try and look around the certificates and things that you find, you start to see the stories and the people and the humanity. And you can only think that my great grandmother must have been producing antibodies, and that's what saved that 10-day-old baby who grew up to be a man who had a long life. But it must have been so scary. And to be able to look through those records and find this, and now our family knows about these girls. We know about Leigh and Rachel, and we can remember them. Whereas because they were so early in her children, the ones who had been alive were still very young. So when they grew up, they've either forgotten or they've not talked about it, maybe because it was upsetting. And they've been forgotten from the family. Those girls were lost to us. And there's so many lost children out there in our family histories that we don't remember. And we can look back through our family history and find these children and remember them and know that they lived, they mattered. There was so much love around their life and probably so much devastation around their death. And that kind of disappears if we don't search for it and find it. And then we can, bring it back. So that's one of the things when I was researching that made me go, wow. And then go, I want to do more of this. It's not just about getting the data and the names and dates and so was born then and died then. It's about finding traces of the emotions that they felt in their lives and the things that were happening with them. Yeah.
No, thank you so much for sharing that, because that is so very true, that you'll find things that you weren't expecting because, again, either someone was aware of it or most times people were not aware of it. So thank you so much. That is very true. And I guess, this leads me into my next question. Like, why do you believe that genealogy is so important, especially for Caribbean communities and, of course, descendants of the diaspora?
I think it's hugely important for that kind of preserving these stories that we have in our families, wherever your ancestors are from. I think that's an important thing. Our ancestors, all of them had their hardships that they went through and fought through, and we can honour them in remembering that. But being part of the diaspora, especially the diaspora in Britain, it can be a hard thing to be over here. It can be really difficult to just hold on to your identity and hold on to your worth with a lot of the microaggressions and systemic racism that you have living in the West. So being able to rediscover your ancestors, to build upon that connection and remember who you are and who you came from, I think that is so important in just a bit of your toolkit to help you survive out here, really. And I really think that that's something that a lot of the diaspora, especially as we get further and further away from that 20th century migration that happened, a lot haven't been to the Caribbean. They haven't visited their islands. They're losing touch with the culture, with the history. A lot don't know their history either. And like when I was going through the Spanish flu epidemic, it was very easy to realize I've got gaps in my history. And the more you can't do family history just on its own, you have to cover geography, you have to cover history, and that exposure it makes it personal as well because you're looking at your ancestors at that time, but it increases your knowledge of the history. And if we don't know our history, then we're just going to repeat mistakes. We need to know our history to be able to go forward and to know who we are.
No, I couldn't agree with you more. I definitely believe it does center you, especially being in the West. And it gives you a sense of a belonging for what it is that who you come from, the stories that are there, and of course, as you said, the resilience and the characters, because some things do get passed on. It just becomes innate within us, right?
Yeah.
So you've also worked with DNA. What was your introduction to DNA genealogy, and how do you use it alongside the traditional research methods?
So when I was younger, I was a questioning child, so I did ask a lot of questions about who we were and where we came from. And I didn't really have a name for what I was because I'm a mix of Indo and Afro-Caribbean. So I didn't really have a name for myself. A girl at school said, "Oh, so you're a coolie?" And I said to my mum, "I guess I'm a coolie." She was like, "No, no, we don't say that." I was like, "Okay." But so I was always wondering, like, what am I? And my elder sisters would say, "Well, if you get get a mixing pot and you get a bit of this and a bit of that and you stir it all up, that's us." So a couple of years ago, I actually did a DNA test with 23andMe just to see what's in that mix. And that was really interesting. And I saw some DNA matches. I thought, okay, that's cool. And didn't really think much of it. But I also started doing the family history about that time. And I saw some names come up and I asked one of my older sisters about it. She was like, "Oh, that name, they're family friends of ours." And I was like, "Okay, well, they're coming up as related." So started digging and it actually turned out that this man was the grandson, I think, of my great grandmother's half sister. And I was able to use that connection to find my great grandmother's father because we had no idea who he was. And he wasn't on the birth certificate. We had no clues at all. But that half sister had got married. And when she got married, her father's name was on the marriage certificate. So by piecing that through, they'd say, "Oh, they're not family friends. They're relations." It's just that they shared the connection coming down the line and maybe forgotten, or at least the younger ones. When I then went and talked to elders several years later, they're like, "Yeah, we're family. Of course we are." I'm like, "Oh, right. Okay, well, that could have saved me a bit of work." But the younger ones had forgotten that connection. So I was like, "Oh, we can use, it's not just about these ethnicity estimates. We can actually start to use it for the matches and we can try and find these ancestors where you have those breaks in the written records, you can use that." I'm using it a lot at the moment to try and get around that difficulty with the Trinidadian records. So going through these databases, pulling out matches, trying to find clusters of I share DNA with this person, we also share with this person, triangulate it and say, right, this is a group of people. Who's that common ancestor that we're coming down from? Trying a bit of DNA painting and things like that just to plug those gaps. And it can be so helpful when it's used in that way.
Yeah, no, definitely it can. It just fills in all the gaps that you can't find for the paper. So that kind of leads me into my next now in terms of, which do you prefer? Is it DNA testing or paper trail genealogy? And why?
Yeah, I can't choose between them. So it's a bit of a cop-out answer. But the reason for that is I don't believe that either can be used in isolation. If you just go down the DNA route and you haven't built those family trees and you haven't done that research through the documents, you're going to struggle to verify anything. You're just going to have matches and centimorgans and a big puzzle that you can't work out. If you just go down the documented trail, you'll get to where I got with that great grandmother And you'd be like, well, I can't find her father, and I've got no way of finding it, and there's no records written, and you can't get back. But if you combine it and really, really combine it, so don't just look at your own documents and your own documented history, find a match, find out as much as you can about their family, and then build their family tree through the documents, and then try and see where you match up. That's the kind of thing that can really, really help. And then take, I suppose, the inverse of that, look at your DNA painting, find those segments that you now know come from one root ancestor, and then look at your other matches and say, they've also got that segment of DNA. They must come from that root ancestor. So you can kind of do it in both ways, to use the records to find out who your matches are, and then use your matches to find out who other matches are, and then find the records that matches them. It's got to be interconnected. And I think some people go just down one path and they don't want to look at another, or they think another one's not quite as good or as useful. And I think they're missing out on a lot that it can do for you.
No, definitely. I think you said it well. It has to be a blend of them both to use. So, what, Daniela, that you could tell for people to, what kind of expectations would you set to someone just starting their family history journey, especially in the Caribbean context?
So keep an open mind, I think, is the biggest thing I will say. We get passed a lot of stories down, and there can be grains of truth in all of these stories. But if you hold on too tightly to them sometimes, it can send you down that wrong path. So gather as many stories as you can. Talk to your elders, really, any elders you can, even family friends. If they're living in the area, they may know a lot of your family history because people talk. But find out what your oral history says, because once that's gone, it's gone. We can't use DNA to get oral history back. We can't use records to get oral history back. That's that third bit in that triangle that you really need to use, that oral history to help you. To look at your oral history, take things with a pinch of salt, but don't disregard them just because they seem like completely wild. One client, she said, "Oh, my grandmother says we come from Egypt, but I don't believe that. I don't see it in the DNA or anything like that." And I was like, "Okay." And then I took her back to the start of, to emancipation. We got back to about there, and we saw that just after emancipation, her ancestors were living near a plantation called Egypt. And it was like, okay. So hold those stories, keep them in your mind, because unfortunately she hasn't taken the work further. So I don't know if they were actually on that plantation. They might have been, or her grandmother might have just meant that they were from around that area by Egypt. But hold on to them, no matter how outlandish or wild they might seem. There might be a grain of truth in them, but don't hold so tightly that you can't see anything. I've had some people say, "Oh, well, we're definitely from this country in Europe. The great-grandfather was definitely from there." And I'm like, okay, well, the records don't say that. The records or the DNA is pointing towards something else. But they're like, well, no, that can't be right. That must be the wrong record, because they've been passed this down through the generations and they're holding on very tightly to that. You won't find all of your ancestors. And that's the sad truth of it. You will get some roads that become a dead end. And it can be incredibly frustrating, because some people will get very, very far down one line and you're looking like, but I'm working twice as hard as them. I'm not finding it. But it can be luck of the draw as to what records have survived, because there's been so much damage to records over the years. And also just what records were actually made in the first place. If the record wasn't made, you're not going to find it. If that piece of the book has been torn out or has been eaten by termites or something, you're not going to find that particular baptism record. But you can get creative and you can do all kinds of things to kind of get around that. It's a really kind of, let's call it the fan method, friends and neighbours, I think it stands for, but going really wide and around that. And that's what I do for a lot of clients. I've got some that are completely new to family research and they haven't done anything at all. And still basic family tree. Others have been researching for few years. I just don't know how to get around this. I can't find this record. and I'll spend 10 hours or so, and I will dig through and I'll look in the whole neighborhood, find those relations and say, okay, well, it looks like this is their cousin, looks like this is an uncle, looks like this is, let's get round to the next generation that way, because that baptism record just isn't there. And we're not finding it. We can't get their parents' name that way. Be creative, go round.
No, definitely you have to. You can't be too specific, because then you'll just get more frustrated. Now, Danielle, in your business, what has been a challenge or an objection you've encountered from a client or a situation, and how did you handle it?
I had one recently, I think this fits into your question, but I was talking to somebody who basically managed a library of records. And I was asking, what do you have records about the Caribbean? It's like a family history library. Like, do you have any records relating to the Caribbean? Oh, yeah, we do, but it's it's more about the people who came from Europe. I was like, oh, okay, that's great. What kind of, well, like Wales. Wales are great. You can get a lot of information from Wales. Oh, I think it's not really. It's more about the people from Europe. I was like, right, okay. And I think what she was basically saying was that the ancestors of me and my clients, I'm not going to find them in these particular records. And you see this in two ways. You see it from people of Afro-Caribbean and Indo-Caribbean descent, where they kind of lock out part of their ancestors. Those aren't my ancestors because they're European. You see it from Europeans, they're like, oh no, these can't be your ancestors because they're Europeans. There's a whole issue around European ancestors for us, where some of them might have been voluntary, a lot of them weren't voluntary, and there's a whole lot of emotion wrapped up in that. But they are still in that ancestral path. And I found it quite frustrating that somebody who is very much involved in family history was completely oblivious to the fact that my ancestors might have their wills registered with them, because I do have European ancestors, but it just didn't occur to her at all that that might be something that interested me, because obviously I was only interested in the enslaved ancestors. It's tricky and it is personal. Some people don't want to, and that is absolutely their prerogative to not dive into that side. But for me, I look at it that they are my ancestors, and whether they would be happy with me being their descendant or not, that's not up to them. So that's me and that is my history. And I get a little bit of glee sometimes because I'm like, oh, how do you feel about me telling your story? You probably don't like it, but it's it's part of our makeup and part of who we are. And sometimes it feels a bit like the elephant in the room where people just don't want to acknowledge.
No, definitely. It's a lot of that, of acknowledgement, and of course of the fact of that we're connected in some way, shape, or fashion, and for us to be able to get access to those records, to be able to see what was probably really said, what was really discussed, because sometimes it is quite eye-opening. And again, as you said before previously, it does come with a lot of emotions to see records like this. So that's just one thing, right? So, Danielle, how do you approach cases where the paper trail runs cold or the DNA reveals unexpected information? Like, how do you handle that with clients?
The DNA side, it's a really sensitive thing. And I have had cases where I've contacted somebody and they're like, oh, we're coming up as a match. And do you have any relatives from this area? And they're like, no, but m- my aunt's family is from there or something. And it was basically that it seems that her father wasn't her father. Her father was somebody else who was a close relation of mine. Well, the first time that happened to me, I was like, oh my God, what have I just dropped on this poor lady? Thankfully, she was like, oh, yes, I got a whole new family to look at. And I was like, she's taking this surprisingly well. But I try and be very careful in what I say. And it can be difficult when you're having these conversations online to see how somebody's reacting to it. You don't get that feedback that you get when you're talking to somebody to know whether you should say more or say less. It's, I do say, if anybody does their DNA, you have to do it with a mind of, might find something I'm not expecting to find. And am I ready to do that? Am I ready to dive into that? And in some cases, people just want to be like, no, I'm not looking into that. I don't want to hear any more about that. In other cases, they're like, oh, right, okay, let's dig deeper. Let's find more. And then you help them on that. When the records go cold, I was saying earlier, you've really got to do that creative thinking and go wide and just look at everything you can, which again, really easy to do on the Jamaican records because you can just scroll through the parish records or the birth, marriage, death records and find everything. Trinidadian records, incredibly difficult to do that because if you don't have the mother's maiden name, you can't get access to the birth records at all. So you have to know the surnames to be able to do it. So you can't just be like, oh, well, I'll just dig around for anybody with that surname because they won't give you access to view that record.
And just going on with the records for Trinidad and Tobago, does Family Search have any records at all when it comes to Trinidad and Tobago?
No, so I meant to say that at the start and I completely forgot. But for Jamaica, you can get those records on Family Search, parish records, civil records. Trinidad, there's just nothing online for the civil records at all. And accessing them, even paying for copies of certificates, is difficult. And you have like there's you don't have any indentureship records at all, and there's no parish records available online either. It is just dearth of records. It's really really difficult because it feels like you know that if you could access those, you could sit through, you could wade through, you can find this. The knowledge is there, the information is there. You just have, I suppose, bureaucracy blocking you from accessing it, and that is very very frustrating. Family Search has tried to scan them, I've been told. They've offered to do it a few times, but Trinidad and Tobago said they don't want that. So it's very difficult. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess, that's the challenge. And then I guess, what would you say in terms of, with building your business, what has it taught you about resilience, identity, and belonging?
One of the main things it's given me is a bit more confidence in myself. I have a lot of imposter syndrome and a lot of feelings of, oh, well, if I can do this, anybody can do this. But it's taught me that I do have something unique to offer people and that I can help people with this. And there's people that need this help. So that's been a bit of a boost for me. It's been a bit of a push myself out there. I'm so big at but it's tough for that. It's also my own personal journey into the genealogy has helped me feel a lot more connected to my identity, which is something I struggled with when I was younger growing up in Britain. And it's helped me feel rooted to areas, to just feel, more connected to my identity, and helped me bridge that gap and help me pass that on to my children as well so that they don't have that feeling of disconnect.
Well, definitely. And then finally, Daniela, what message would you like to leave to our listeners, whether they're seasoned researchers or just beginning the journey?
Keep the faith, keep digging, keep talking to those elders, even the conversations that you might be putting off. Pick up that phone and call them, because once they've gone and you've lost that chance, they've got stories to tell you, and they'll enjoy telling you those stories mostly. And just keep digging, keep sharing, and share it with others. Although you're finding out your family history, it's also the family history, all of those other descendants. So share it with them. You'll be surprised at how much these other descendants have in terms of oral history and possibly even family photos and things like that. I say that it takes a village to do Caribbean family history. With English or American family history, you can go back very far, very quickly, on your own, sitting on Ancestry. it's slower, much, much slower to do Caribbean history. And you need to draw from wider oral history, wider records, and just build wide and enjoy yourself doing it as well. It can be very fun, but read around as well. Read around the history because that will help you, and pick up maps. Maps are really helpful, especially if, like me, you haven't been to the Caribbean as much. Using those maps can really help you become familiar with areas.
No, definitely, definitely will. It'll definitely guide you, as you said, to make it a wide search and then having to go back to be very narrow, because that's what connects things, because you don't know which people, who they were doing business with, neighbors. They know more of the history sometimes than some family members. But I do appreciate your time coming on, speaking to this, and of course, speaking about your business as well, which I'll put in the show notes where if people want to connect to you, they can, because it is valuable information, and just to be able to assist present people if we can to know how and why and some of the challenges that they may face, and not to give up. So thank you.
Well, thank you. I've had a great time. I love talking about family history. It's one of my definite passions. So thank you very much for having me.
Hoped you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcast. Thank you.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.